A few months ago, I finally watched The Hateful Eight, Quentin Tarantino's latest movie. Not one of his best, but I couldn't help but notice the similarities it had with his first movie. In many ways it felt like he has come full circle, and that started me thinking about his career until now. Especially since Tarantino is arguably the greatest director of postmodern cinema, and I've been trying to explain postmodernism to my viewers. I made one video about postmodernism in philosophy. Now it's time to make one about postmodernism in art. Moreover, when an artist becomes popular, it means that they are touching a nerve, expressing a new sensibility. The power of art is that it can say the things that our rationality is incapable of uttering yet, things that we feel to be true even if we don't have the concepts to explain it. So I am going to provide a retrospective of Quentin Tarantino's career, and through it I am going to ask, what does his art tell us about our time? I should note that I never explored Tarantino's art before, so this video is not going to be an in-depth analysis. It will be more of a review on how his movies connect to today's culture, and how they reflect it. Because of that, we shall begin with another retrospective. The genre that Tarantino usually works in is the crime movie, a genre that has a long and illuminating history in Hollywood cinema. So let's begin by doing a very brief review of the history of this genre. Again, it's not going to be detailed. I'm talking fast. Just what we need as a necessary background. Crime stories, of course, are an important part of American folklore. As the American pop industry was beginning to take shape in the late 19th century, some of its biggest folk heroes were the outlaws of the Wild West, like Billy the Kid or Jesse James. They were feared and reviled, but they were also seen as representing the unbound and daredevil American spirit. The period that we call the Wild West ended around the 1890s, and this is also the decade when people started to make motion pictures. One of the earliest motion pictures to have a narrative was The Great Train Robbery, from 1903, that depicts a train robbery in the Wild West. As the American movie industry came to be in the next 2 decades, the Western became one of its main staples, and the outlaws were central figures. In the 1920s, the age of Prohibition, a new folk hero was born, the gangster, the outlaw of the urban landscape. And in the 30s, that led to the rise of a new movie genre, the gangster flick. Starting from Little Caesar, in 1931, gangster flicks were one of the main features of the decade. This was also the time when Hollywood started to feel the sword of censorship hanging over its head, and created the Hays Code, a form of self-censorship that limited what could be said and shown in film. The violence in gangster movies had to therefore be justified, so they usually opened with a disclaimer that pointed out the social value of discussing the gangster problem and declared that this was the intent behind the making of the movie. This tells us a lot about the modern age. The modern age, which, following a common practice, I define as beginning in the late 18th century, was characterized by the idea that man needs to grow and mature, and reach his full potential, and then he will be able to create a perfect society. Now when I say man, I mean humankind, but the modern thinkers refer to it as man, because the idea was that humankind has universal traits, which are shared by everyone. Every man is an individual with a unique side, particular only to him, but every man also has a side that he shares with everyone else. Once we figure out what the universal side of man is, we will be able to create a society based on it, and then we will have a perfect utopia, in which every individual will be able to freely express his unique side. Now, that means that every individual expresses the universal side of man in some way, so if we want to learn and figure out what man is, we should explore all types of humans, and that includes the criminal. Actually, modern thought saw the criminal as a particularly educational specimen. By studying what it was that made him go bad, we can learn a lot about the nature of man. The 30s gangster flicks were usually written from a superior point of view, where the viewer knows exactly why the gangster is doing what he's doing, and why he's going to fail. Of course, every movie had its own theory. Those that were written by left-wing screenwriters tended to blame society for the hero going bad, and the implication was that if society would be structured right, there would be no criminals. Those that were written from a right-wing point of view tended to place the blame on the sinful nature of man, and the implication was that only strong law enforcement can create a good society. But the people who went to see these movies did not do it for their educational value, and the creators knew it. The urban gangster, much like the prairie outlaw that preceded him, was a folk hero. The gangsters were those who provided the public with booze during Prohibition, displaying the old renegade American spirit. The hero of the gangster flick was always a gutsy and capable individualist, who outsmarts the law and his gangster rivals time after time, and does it with style. Through him, the viewers could vicariously live out their own antisocial fantasies, reveling in his victories, right up to the inevitable tragic end. These movies may have pretended to speak to an enlightened crowd, which manifests the mature and sociable side of man, but they knew that they were actually catering to the antisocial traits that are part of all of us. As the decade bore on, the heady days of the Roaring Twenties receded into memory, and the gangsters lost their aura. Crime movies had to find another source of material, and they found it in American pulp fiction. The cheap pulp novels did not have to deal with the lofty ideals of modern thinking, and could instead dwell on the seedy side of life. The urban crime novels focused on tough men who were operating by their own individual code, moving in a world where the distinctions between good and bad weren't that clear. The protagonists were often private detectives, who were on the right side of the law, but not part of the system. Thus, they could still be an individualist hero, without being a criminal. This was just the kind of hero that the consciousness of the time was looking for. The effects of the Great Depression were being felt all around, and confidence in the modern dream diminished. Capitalism and democracy didn't seem so great anymore, and were challenged by communism and fascism. The existentialist philosophy that came from Europe refuted the ideas at the basis of utopian thinking, claimed that there is no grand solution to the puzzle of man, and focused on the individual trying to create a meaningful existence for himself, within a meaningless world. Meanwhile, psychoanalytic thinking was also beginning to infiltrate our collective consciousness, presenting the idea that man isn't as rational as we thought, and that he has an irrational side that cannot be overcome. These ideas found their way into German cinema, which developed techniques to represent the dark and irrational sides of man on screen, resulting in what is known as German Expressionism. And as the German directors started to flee from the Nazis and immigrate to Hollywood, they brought these techniques into American cinema. By the early 40s, all of these influences came together to form a new genre, which was later dubbed film noir. Film noir movies were always black and white, but there were many shades of grey. The world of film noir was a harsh urban landscape populated by shady people, with no absolute good and bad. The motives of the characters weren't always clear, and they were driven by irrational desires, fears, and prejudices. Criminals would still get what was coming to them, but there was no feeling that society became any better as a result. We were all still stuck in this dark world. The era of film noir was between 1944 and 1955, in the aftermath of World War II and the ensuing of the Cold War. But the American consciousness was shifting during those years. The late 40s were still harsh, but the 50s brought an age of affluence, and newfound confidence in the American way of life. The atrocities committed by the fascists and communists helped to solve the existential crisis of the 30s and 40s, as they showed that liberal democracy is by far the best way to go. After the war, the US emerged as the sole leader of the free world, and saw itself as the model of the best society. Having defeated the Nazi evil, it believed it could eradicate all of its inner evils as well, and create a perfect society. A consensus between left and right was achieved, bringing together capitalism and socialism, and everyone was expected to conform to this consensus. If late 40s film noir portrayed the individual as the hero, in the beginning of the 50s it increasingly began to show individualism as the cause of the hero's failure. Meanwhile, the stature of psychology was elevated in American culture, and in Hollywood movies of the time it is portrayed as an exact science. And so, even though it was accepted that man has an irrational side, it was once again believed that human rationality can completely understand it and control it. The belief that we are marching towards the perfect society, and that the American way is what will get us there, was stronger than ever. Cinema, in the meantime, started to perceive itself more seriously, as an art form. Hollywood, in the 50s, started to create heavier dramas, dealing with political, social and psychological issues in a more educated and nuanced way. As the spirit of the time saw America as the society that will lead us to the perfect world, Hollywood moved away from gangster flicks and went back to the basis of movie Americana. Back to the westerns. The legendary outlaws and lawmen of the Wild West now became manifestations of the different facets of man, participating in a drama that explored the nature of man and society. The makings of a perfect society were already there, in the early days of America. We only need to find the right mix. The 50s did see the rise of a new genre of urban crime films, and that was the heist movie. Although many of the best heist movies of the 50s and 60s actually came from movie makers working outside of Hollywood. Maybe it was because these films actually undermined the modern belief that man can devise a perfect world. The main story of the heist movie is a highly clever and elaborate plan to pull off an impossible robbery, but despite the plan being perfect, the heroes always failed, due to the psychologically imperfect nature of man, or simply due to some random bad luck. While Hollywood was dreaming of a perfect society, these movies were there to remind us that man is incapable of perfection. Another thing that happened in the 50s was the rise of youth culture, the first generation of teenagers that had its own consciousness, distinctly different from that of the adults. In hindsight, it was a different consciousness from the modern consciousness, and I call it the pop consciousness. Driven mainly by the new mediums of television and rock and roll music, this generation developed a new consciousness that no longer enslaves itself to the march for a perfect society, because the society we have is good enough. Instead, it focuses on how to find joy in the here and now, extract the most from every historical moment. We know that nothing good lasts forever, but that's okay. We enjoy it as long as it's good, and then we move on to the next exciting thing. This new consciousness was responsible for the opening of a wide generational gap, and, as usual in such cases, society reacted to it with fear. Rock and roll was blamed for corrupting the youth, and some crime movies of the time focused on juvenile delinquents. But by the 60s, the new consciousness was beginning to establish itself. The 60s, in Hollywood, marked the death of the old studio system, in which the studios were in control of every part of the movie-making process. The end of the decade witnessed the rise of a generation of new directors that regarded themselves as artists, and wanted their movies to express their own personal vision. One of the movies that symbolized this spirit was Bonnie and Clyde, released in 1967, which heralded a new era in crime movies. In the next few years, the legendary outlaws of the past would be depicted as pop culture icons, people who broke out of the modern system and lived an exciting existence for a while, until the very last moment. They were part of the rebellious spirit of the time. Of course, not everyone internalized the change. Many youngsters were still stuck in the modern frame of mind, and understood the rebellious spirit of the 60s as heralding a revolution that will bring utopia right away. A Marxist spirit took over the academies, and led to a lot of violence. But the Marxist utopia didn't materialize, and the failure made many people lose faith in the modern dream. The early 70s saw the return of film noir, with incredibly dark movies that usually ended with evil triumphing over good, suggesting that we are not heading towards utopia, but rather in the other direction. With the shattering of the modern consciousness, came the realization that there was something wrong about the concept of man. It defined man in Western European terms, thus giving advantage to white people. It also disadvantaged women, because it placed them in the role of the companion. In reaction, pop culture started to pay more attention to group identity, and to helping other groups have their say. In modern consciousness, the enlightened position was that we are all basically the same, and the cultural differences are something that we need to overcome. Therefore, Hollywood movies would not mention the ethnicity of the characters. A white American actor could represent any person of any ethnicity. The 70s brought change, and movies actually wanted to celebrate the different ethnicities in America. A young generation of Italian-American directors made movies about Italian gangsters, and brought Italian-American culture to the big screen. As befitting Italian cultural artifacts, these movies were quite tragic in nature, something that can't be said about the African-American version of the crime movie, the so-called blaxploitation films. These films revolved around the harsh realities of the black ghettos, and sometimes dealt with serious themes, but mostly they were violent fantasies that subverted the conventions of the gangster movies, in that the criminal almost always got away with it. The hero of a blaxploitation movie was a badass individualist who would manage to outsmart his black rivals and eventually defeat the white man as well. These movies were aimed at black crowds and seldom watched by the white public. By the end of the 70s, the left-wing academics finally realized that Marx was wrong, and also that the entire modern paradigm no longer holds sway. They talked about the collapse of the modern grand narrative, the narrative of man progressing towards perfection, and defined it as the postmodern condition, where there is no longer a grand narrative that unites us all. American politics, however, were not quite ready to give up on the utopian dream. With the fall of the left-wing version, the right offered a version of its own, claiming that capitalism and hyper-individualism will create a perfect society. The 80s were all about the individual, working within the capitalist system to achieve success, overcoming the obstacles that collectivism put in their way. Criminals were often shown as individualists who are beating the system. They're not bad people, just people who were dealt a bad hand and are trying to make the best of it. On the other hand, they could be shown as people who are trying to game the capitalist system in evil ways, in which case they must be brought down. And that is what made the 80s the greatest decade for police movies. But the postmodern condition began to infiltrate Hollywood as well. In the 80s, the Coen brothers already began to make movies that subverted the expectations of the viewer, going in directions that defied the modern conventions of storytelling. The audience was tired of seeing the same old story about how enlightened society manages to work out its differences, and wanted other narratives. The Coen brothers worked in many genres and subverted them all, but their favorite was always the crime movie. Focusing on heroes living outside of conformed society enabled them to take the story in lots of unexpected directions. Another director that went against the grain in that decade was David Lynch. In his 1985 movie Blue Velvet, one of the heroes is a woman who gets sadistically brutalized and raped, but is shown to actually enjoy it. Critics accused Lynch that he is promoting the idea that all women want to be raped, but he replied, "No, it's just this woman." His critics were still thinking in modern terms, in which every character reveals something about the universal nature of man. Lynch was already thinking in postmodernist terms, in which there is no universal human nature. His movies featured freaky and bizarre people, celebrating the diversity of the human race. And, since these types usually live on the outskirts of society, they were mostly crime movies. In the 90s, postmodernist cinema took over. The two changes we mentioned, telling original stories instead of the same old story about progress towards enlightenment, and celebrating the diversity of human character instead of showing everyone as facets of the universal man, became constant features. As a result, the 90s were, by far, the greatest decade for crime movies. There were other reasons that helped. The capitalist bonanza of the 80s collapsed, leaving a world full of people who were hungry for financial success, but living in recession. And with that, the realization finally sank in that we are not heading towards a perfect world, which means that crime will always be part of our life. This opened up the field for many dramas that asked how to deal with crime as a constant feature of society. All of that ensured that there would be great and rich content for crime movies. But to truly become the greatest decade for crime movies, the 90s needed something more. Great art is not just about content, it is also about form that matches this content. It is about style. And when it came to giving style to this new crime cinema, there was one movie director that towered above the rest. Quentin Tarantino was born in Tennessee in 1963 and displayed enthusiasm for movies from a very early age, setting him on course to becoming an actor, a screenwriter, and a director. He became part of the industry in the 80s, but we are going to ignore the things he did in that decade, including this appearance on The Golden Girls. In the late 80s, he was working in a video store, watching movies every day, and was developing an idea for an independently produced crime thriller. Eventually, with the help of veteran actor Harvey Keitel, he managed to raise the money to finance it, and a cast of talented young actors. Being such a movie buff, the script he was writing was made of bits and pieces of other movies, put together to create something new, a kind of hip-hop approach that would characterize all of his later movies as well. In 1992, he released his first feature film, Reservoir Dogs. Nothing could have prepared the world for this movie. It is actually just a little story about a heist gone wrong, nothing we haven't seen in movies countless times before, but the way in which it is told was original and shocking. Being a low-budget independent flick, it takes place almost entirely in one place, in real time, without a lot of action actually happening on screen, but the style makes it seem like there is non-stop action. Two hallmarks of the Tarantino style hit you right away. First is the non-linear way in which the story is told. The second is the extremely graphic, yet highly aestheticized, way in which violence is depicted. With those two elements, Tarantino keeps us extremely unnerved, as he unravels the tale of unraveling. We are in the aftermath of a botched robbery, and along with the characters, we are trying to piece together the details of what happened. The criminals don't know each other, having been put together by a crime boss for this particular job, but they know that there's a rat in their midst. As they, and us, try to figure out who it is, suspicions and suspense rise, eventually ending in a bloodbath. This is the image of human society that Tarantino portrays for us. Not a congregation of individuals who are all connected because they are different facets of universal man, but disconnected agents who are trying to get along. And they are not individuals either. We don't know their names, as they all have code names based on colors, and they don't represent organic and whole beings, but are made up of disconnected memories. The backbone of the story is the friendship between Mr. White and Mr. Orange, but we eventually find out that this bond was formed for rather spurious reasons. Nevertheless, it becomes so strong that to maintain it, Mr. White is willing to turn on much deeper and longer relationships, with no rational reason behind it. Human society, in short, is depicted as held together by arbitrary ties, which can be quite easily severed. Another glaring attribute shown by the characters in the movie is their lack of empathy to other people, their utter disregard for human life. In the modern age, the idea was that we are all part of the same humanity, marching together towards our common goal, so we should care for each other. With the collapse of this idea, Tarantino shows us a world in which empathy does not exist. However, we need to remember that characters in a postmodernist movie are not meant to represent all of humanity. A common theme in Quentin's movies is the idea that there exists a certain type of people who are born with no empathy, and with lust for murder. Or, as he calls them, natural-born killers. This was also the title of a movie directed by Oliver Stone, which Tarantino wrote the story for, and came out in 1994. This type of people is what most of his movies will revolve around. Oliver Stone wasn't really the right director to direct a Tarantino-written movie, but the movie did add to his notoriety, and helped create a buzz for his second feature, coming out later in '94. Now a Hollywood director with the budget and cast to create the movie he wanted to make, he could display his full prowess, and the result was one of the most game-changing movies of all time. Pulp Fiction contains all of the themes that we've met already: the non-linear storytelling, the graphic violence, the disregard for human life. But it adds more, in both content and style. First of all, in its treatment of dialogue. In the movies of the modern age, dialogues had two clear purposes: either to advance the plot, or to say something about the themes and messages that the film was trying to convey. Preferably both. Every word had to have a subtext, related to the overall piece, and if it didn't, it was considered a flaw. Modern thought, in general, was dismissive of everyday talk. The early 20th century philosopher Martin Heidegger called it prattle, and claimed that we only do it to avoid having to deal with existential questions. But in pop consciousness, everyday life is to be lived for its own sake, not in the service of some other existence. Our everyday talk is actually an enjoyable thing, one of the things that give life its flavor. Tarantino wanted his dialogue to reflect the way people actually talk in real life, and the challenge in this case is to do it without boring the viewers. You have to write dialogue that isn't germane to the plot yet still captivating, and this is where Tarantino revealed himself as the grand master of postmodern cinema. We see glimpses of it in Reservoir Dogs, but in Pulp Fiction he displays his full talent. The movie showed that you can have an entire conversation about prosaic things like hamburgers, and still hold the viewer's attention for several minutes. And, within all this seemingly mundane talk, also include elements that advance the plot. In 1994, this type of dialogue writing was completely fresh and stimulating. This is reflected in the visuals as well. Tarantino's movies contain a lot of close-ups of hamburgers and other types of food and drink, with no real connection to the plot. This is how our mind works, not in a linear way, but jumping from mundane things to existential problems. Once he lulls you into the dialogue and distracts you with shots of food, Tarantino will suddenly present a turn, in which it switches at once into matters of life and death. A recurring shot in his movies is close-ups on people's faces as they open up things, and find something inside that is about to change the situation, and we see the look on their face in this moment of turn. Life, Tarantino shows us, is not ruled by a narrative. It is just a haphazard collection of events, some of them major, which come in a random order. Another recurring shot that we see in this movie, and then in subsequent movies, is close-ups on women's feet. This is obviously meant to symbolize how in the postmodern world we are not going anywhere. So we have taken off our shoes and put our feet up. Anyway, that conversation in the beginning about how giving a woman a foot massage is almost the same as eating her pussy sure gets another dimension now, doesn't it? Just like in Reservoir Dogs, we see how much we are ruled by our irrational side, putting the lie to the modern belief that man's rational side can win. Many of the choices made by the characters have no rational explanation. Butch risks his life to obtain a watch that is his most prized possession, even though this watch seems to have brought nothing but bad luck to his family. Jules suddenly decides to leave the life of crime, just because a lucky freak occurrence makes him believe that he was touched by God, even though it is shortly followed by a freak occurrence of really bad luck. Butch wants to kill Marcellus, but when they are faced with a common enemy, he goes out of his way to save his life. Unless we think it's just the characters on screen, the movie shows us that we are the same way. In the first part we identify with Vincent, even though he's a criminal. Then we identify with Butch as he runs away from Vincent. And when they face each other, we become confused. At that moment, Tarantino makes us face our own irrational choice-making. Like in the previous movie, this too ends in a Mexican standoff, but this time they don't all shoot each other. It is a more optimistic ending, which comes as a result of the moral awakening of Jules. He is helped in this awakening by a Bible verse, Ezekiel 25:17, which he used to recite before he killed people, but now he ponders on the meaning of the words, and it makes him re-evaluate his ways. So it seems that Tarantino offers us a way out from this immoral world. The Bible does what it is supposed to do, and leads a soul to salvation. There's just one little problem though. This verse is not Ezekiel 25:17. It is nowhere to be found in Ezekiel 25. It is not from Ezekiel at all. It is not even from the Bible. It is actually taken from a 1970s martial arts film. Jules thinks that he is reciting the Bible, but he is just remembering something he once saw in the movies. The spirituality of the characters in Tarantino's movies does not draw from the Bible. It draws from pop culture. The name of the movie already hints at this spirituality. Pulp Fiction is considered synonymous with lowbrow fiction, which doesn't deal with noble ideals or displays high artistic merits. But, exactly because of that, it wasn't bound to modern ideals and could allow for the sensibilities of pop consciousness to develop, the consciousness that now has taken over. Our existence within a pop world is punctuated in a scene in the movie where we find ourselves in a 50s-style diner. The 50s were the starting point of the rock and roll generation, of the youth rebellion that created the post-war pop explosion. In the 70s and 80s, many movies went back to the period from the mid-50s to the early 60s, trying to relive that spirit of creating a new world. By the 90s, however, this story too started to feel tired, and movies that were about rock and roll rebellion were highly self-aware and ironic. Pulp Fiction takes place in a world created in the 50s, but shows it crumbling. The soundtrack tells the same story. The rock and roll revolution of the 50s soon found its way into movies, feeding their soundtrack with lots of original pop music, rivaling the music that dominated soundtracks until then, which was mostly made by composers working in the classical tradition. This process culminated in the 80s, when most movies had a soundtrack written by a current pop act. By the 90s, however, the musical scene was no longer dominated by classic rock and roll, and was taken over by newer styles, originating in punk, metal, hip-hop, disco and electronica. The characters in Tarantino's first 3 movies don't connect to these new styles, but rather listen to songs from the 60s and 70s, which by then were oldies that belonged to a time gone by. The soundtrack of Pulp Fiction contains no original tunes, only classics from the past, intensifying the feeling that we are watching a dying world. The first director to systematically use older music in his movies was Stanley Kubrick, who started doing it in the 1960s. Kubrick claimed that there is no way that contemporary soundtrack composers could rival the great composers of the past, so he used the classics for his soundtracks. He specified, however, that this only applies to classical music, not to pop music. Well, by the mid-90s, this applied to pop music as well, as it was past its prime. Tarantino, like Kubrick, excavates the history of music for his soundtracks, but he does it with pop, not classical music. After Tarantino, this would be done by many other Hollywood directors. This theme of the death of the old world is explored more thoroughly in Tarantino's next movie, Jackie Brown from 1997. We meet all the themes we've met before in this movie as well, but with none of the glamour that Pulp Fiction gives them. Instead, it is a movie about people who are in the middle of their life, people who never made it but are still dreaming of scoring big, and they are trying to cope with the fact that they are growing old. The gangster here is a small-time arms dealer, and everything about his world is lame, fake, and sad. We are witnessing the death throes of the culture that ruled since the 50s, and it is told by evoking one of the genres that were part of that culture, the blaxploitation movie. As I already mentioned, the 70s blaxploitation movies were aimed at black audiences. But, just like with every other artifact of black American pop culture in the 20th century, there were white youngsters who were drawn to it. Black culture appealed to whites because in many ways it was more liberated. Blacks, being the other of American society, were not expected to behave according to the values of its highly Puritan culture, and could do things that would ruin the reputation of a white person. For white liberals, they were role models, providing cultural artifacts that, once appropriated and given a white interpretation, had a liberating cultural effect. The blaxploitation movies were low budget and quite poorly made, but they provided hyper-individualism, hyper-realism, hyper-violence, and hypersexuality. Tarantino, the movie buff, absorbed the first three into his style, and was now ready to pay homage to this genre, by bringing elements of it into his new film. One of the things that typified the blaxploitation film was the female characters. At a time when white women were only beginning to throw away the old conservative norms, blaxploitation chicks were individualistic and tough, and didn't hesitate to use their sexuality as a weapon. And there was one female blaxploitation star that stood above the rest. Armed with a killer afro, tons of attitude, and the greatest pair of breasts in cinema history, Pam Grier was the embodiment of a badass chick. But when the blaxploitation era came to an end in the late 70s, her career sank into obscurity. Until Tarantino came, and offered her the lead in his new movie. The movie Jackie Brown is based on an Elmer Leonard novel called Rum Punch, whose heroine is called Jackie Burke. The movie changes her surname to Brown, probably a reference to Grier's most famous role, Foxy Brown, thus tying the story to the blaxploitation genre. Here, Grier plays a stewardess in her mid-40s, no longer foxy but still fine, but living a rather fade life. She gets caught between the gangsters and the authorities, and devises a clever heist to fool both of them and run away with the money. The movie actually has a fairy tale ending, uncharacteristic of Tarantino. It's probably one of the reasons why it is among his least celebrated works. But the fact that a black woman comes out on top was very much in the spirit of the time. American pop culture, up until the 90s, was dominated by the exchange between black and white boys. This exchange brought the rise of many new experiences, which became the basis for musical subcultures and other joyful subcultures. By the mid-90s, as we've discussed, it felt like this cultural vein has run dry. When it came to girls, however, it felt like there were still places to go, new freedoms to explore and conquer. By the late 90s, women increasingly became the main protagonists in movies and TV shows. Jackie Brown was part of that wave, but mostly, of course, it was about younger women. Action movies, in particular, were taken over by a new type of female hero. Ass-kicking, cool, sexually liberated, and strong. It was all very celebratory and optimistic, promising a future of full gender equality and harmony between the genders. It was fun and exciting for a while, but by 2003, Tarantino was ready to come back from a 6-year hiatus to show us the dark side of this dream. The movie Kill Bill is 4 hours long, compelling Tarantino to split it into 2 movies, with Volume 2 coming 6 months after Volume 1. The premise seems at first to be a parody of Charlie's Angels, one of the movies that expressed the celebratory spirit of the time, but it is actually closer to Fox Force 5, the TV show that Uma Thurman's Pulp Fiction character was supposed to star in. The show, as it is described in Pulp Fiction, is an obvious dig by Tarantino at the attempts of Hollywood to become more ethnically diverse, as it stars 5 women of different ethnicities. We are told that it never went into production, but in Kill Bill, Uma Thurman actually gets to be a former member of such a group, who is now on a revenge mission to kill them all. The first fight we see is against the black chick, and we still feel like we are in Tarantino's world, revolving around white and black Americans. But then the movie spreads out, both geographically and stylistically, and we find ourselves in styles that did not originate in Hollywood: Japanese anime, Asian martial arts movies, and spaghetti westerns. This is a new pop culture. Although we see that the collective consciousness is still informed mainly by American pop,
silly rabbit. Tricks are for kids.
It is not that dominant anymore. When Bill mentions his favorite 70s soul record, the younger Beatrix doesn't know what he's talking about. Her musical taste is different. In the 21st century, mainly thanks to online proliferation, our ears opened up to music from other countries, and the soundtrack of Kill Bill contains many numbers that don't come from Anglo-American pop. In the past, all characters in Hollywood movies used to speak English and be played by American actors, no matter their nationality. It was mainly because the movies were aimed at American audiences, and because English is a universal language, but also it reflected the modern humanist belief that we are all part of the same humanity and cultural differences don't matter. In Kill Bill, characters speak in their native tongue, and also know other languages. It is a new world, a global society. The character of O Ren represents this new global society, being a woman of Chinese, Japanese, American descent, who nevertheless becomes the boss of the Yakuza. Kill Bill is similarly a female-dominated mix of Chinese, Japanese, American action movie traditions, coming to set new rules for action movies. Hollywood, as a whole, was beginning to adapt to the global market, and this was one of the movies that led the way. The theme of decay, which we met in Jackie Brown, exists in this movie as well, but there's one important difference. Here, it is just the men. Kill Bill is not about criminals but about assassins, but almost all of the male characters are retired fighters, living rather paltry lives, reminiscing on their past glories. The female characters, in contrast, are younger, and they are superior to men in every way, including physical abilities. The men are associated with the old dying world. The women are usurping them. It is basically a feminist movie. The main character's name is unknown to us for a long time, and instead she is known by names that are given to her by men: Black Mamba, the Bride, Yellow-Haired Warrior, and Kiddo, which we are led to believe is another nickname. Only after she is presumably dead and buried do we hear her real name, Beatrix Kiddo. It's as if she had to claw her way out of the grave that men made for her to gain control over her identity. This is basically how feminists regard the feminist struggle, and they claim that once women gain control over their identity, it will lead to a better and more harmonious world. But the picture that Tarantino shows us isn't that rosy. There is something lurking beneath the feminist heroism, something a lot more vengeful. Kill Bill is a revenge story, carried out by the hero against the villains. But the real villain here is not Bill and his gang of vipers. It is men. This movie is like a fantasy out of the mind of a man-hating radical feminist. The men are not just losers, they are embodiments of every negative male stereotype. Childish, lazy, cruel, possessive, authoritarian, racist, misogynistic, rapey and pedophilic. Our yellow-haired warrior is there to get revenge on them, to satisfy the violent fantasies of every woman who has ever been wronged by a man. The cinematography makes sure that we realize that it is a fantasy, not a realistic depiction of our world, as if to make us understand that this is a movie about the subconscious of our time, and the dark things that are inhabiting it. But, in case we think that the world will become a better place if women get to rule it, the film destroys that hope as well. Black Mamba and her female peers are all natural-born killers, and as Bill tells us in the end, she cannot escape this nature. We actually see a scene towards the end that suggests that maybe it isn't like that, when Beatrix finds out that she is pregnant, and that leads to a peaceful resolution to a Mexican standoff between her and another female assassin. So motherhood, it seems, can change the nature of our killer. But then we recall Tarantino's non-linear style, and we remember that in the beginning of the movie, we saw a scene that takes place at a later date, and in which Beatrix refuses to spare the life of her mother. In other words, there was no moral transformation, no progress. The movie has a happy ending in which she is reunited with a 4-year-old daughter, but we are also told that this daughter already displayed signs of being a natural-born killer herself. The matriarchy is just as bad as the patriarchy. Nor does the new global society herald a better world. The new feminism, so-called intersectional feminism, which began to rise in the 90s, doesn't just blame men for oppressing women. The patriarchy, as they describe it, is specifically run by white men, who are oppressing not just women but also other ethnicities. The movie seems at first to be on the same page with intersectional feminism, as the main villain is Bill, who is a white man. But as the story unfolds, we learn that Bill's mentors were Mexican, Chinese and Japanese men, and that they came from cultures much crueler than today's white culture. This world will not become a better place if ruled by other ethnicities. Kill Bill begins the period of revenge movies in Tarantino's work. Quentin is half Italian, after all, and revenge stories are a time-honored Italian tradition. But there is something special about his stories. As always, we have a story of heroes taking revenge on villains, but the subtext is satisfying the revenge fantasies of one group of people against another group of people. So, in a way, it is a return to modern cinema, where the characters are representatives of a universal theme. But it is a very ironic return. The heroes, the ones doing the revenge, are different in every movie, but the villain is always the same: white men. And so, the movies become a statement about the growing hatred towards white men in today's society. Tarantino's next movie was Death Proof, from 2007. This is a homage to the exploitation movies of the 1970s, and especially to the theaters that used to show them, known as grindhouse theaters. Again, we see Tarantino's love for the seedier side of pop culture, that side that doesn't have any pretensions but just wants to satisfy our base instincts, but in that, it sometimes succeeds in teaching us something about ourselves. Since the grindhouse theaters tended to provide double features, this movie was also released as a double feature, back to back with Robert Rodriguez's Planet Terror. The entire package was simply named Grindhouse, and both directors tried to remake the experience, including intentionally making it bad quality. Rodriguez goes for the classics, and makes a zombie horror movie, but Tarantino sticks to his own themes, and gives us another female revenge fantasy. The movie seems to be inspired mainly by the bad girl movies of the 60s and 70s, movies about women who were wild and sexy, with a knack to get into trouble. These movies were mildly erotic, and we get mild erotica in Death Proof as well, but since it's Tarantino, we don't get tits and ass, we get feet. Lots and lots of feet. The villain is a psychotic killer, who expresses his lust for women by brutally murdering them. He also has a foot fetish, so this might be Tarantino dealing with his own dark side. While I was writing this, Uma Thurman came out with a story of how she was permanently injured in a car accident during the shooting of Kill Bill, because Tarantino made her drive the defective car. The murder of the Pam character is reminiscent of that, and could be Tarantino processing his own feeling of guilt. One stylistic change that we see in this movie is a departure from the non-linear storytelling. Here, and in the next two movies, we are seeing a mostly straightforward revenge story. The first half of the movie gets us to hate the psycho who murders a bunch of pretty girls. The second part is dedicated to the revenge, as he runs into a bunch of girls that fight back. But again, we are not really seeing a great tale of woman's liberation. The three avenging girls are themselves pretty nasty, and while they are busy getting their revenge, they leave the fourth at the mercy of another man. As I said, during that period Tarantino ditches the non-linear narrative style. But that doesn't mean that he is done messing with time. In his next movie, instead of manipulating the chronology of his own story, he messes with something much bigger: history itself. Inglourious Basterds is yet another movie that casts white men as the villain, and this time it's the epitome of evil white men, the Nazis. The story takes place during World War II, mainly in the last year of the war. Again, for the fourth movie in a row, we see women as the victors, as it is two separate plans hatched by two women that end up destroying the Nazis. But the main heroes of this revenge story are not women, but another group, the Jews. Of course, the Jews never got revenge against the Nazis during the war. After the war they did manage to hunt down some Nazis, but there was never a satisfactory moment of payback. Inglourious Basterds aims to fix that. The movie begins with a very realistic scene, in which Nazis hunt down and kill a Jewish family, but then it gradually gets further and further away from reality, ending up in completely rewriting history, and allowing the Jews to be the ones who bring down the Third Reich. What seems like a realistic movie at first, becomes a total revenge fantasy. But there is another process going on. While the story is completely fictional, there is one subject on which it is very careful to get all the facts straight: cinema. The more the plot gets fantastic, the more we are introduced to the world of movie making in the 30s and 40s, until we find ourselves in a movie theater, where the climax of the fantasy unfolds. This is a movie about movies, and it makes sure we become aware of it. Even the soundtrack is comprised solely of music that was written for other movies. It's as if the world of cinema replaces actual history, attempting to rewrite it, to satisfy through art the payback fantasy that never happened in reality. It is not just a movie about cinema, it's a movie about the magical power of cinema. But did it work? Well, I heard from some Jews that they got a lot of satisfaction watching this movie. It didn't do it for me though. I just enjoyed watching Jews being assholes, something you rarely see in a Hollywood movie. But the fact that it did for others shows how much people are capable of immersing themselves in fiction, and the power of cinema as the ultimate multimedia art to achieve the greatest immersion. And I think that this is exactly what Tarantino wanted to prove. But he manipulates us in other ways as well. The Jews here are hardly good guys. The bastards are not righteous heroes, they are another instance of Tarantino's psychotic killers. They make no distinction between Nazis and regular German soldiers, and basically treat Germans the way the Nazis treated the Jews, refusing to acknowledge their humanity. The image of Hitler, sitting in a movie theater and laughing maniacally at the image of American soldiers being butchered on screen, is a mirror image to those of us who unreservedly enjoy the cruelty displayed towards Germans in this movie. The bastards are led by Lieutenant Aldo Raine, who hails from Tennessee, from the same county Tarantino was born in. He also has Indian blood, another thing he shares with the director, suggesting that in a way he is a projection of Tarantino himself. It's as though Tarantino is the Gentile who is leading the Jews to unleash their unresolved vengeful feelings. Raine relies on his ancestry to borrow the brutal tactics of the Indians and use them against the Germans, making his Jewish soldiers regress into a savage state. Once again we see this motif of civilized Western culture being taken over by the barbaric customs of other cultures. It also casts the Germans in the role of cowboys and the Jews in the role of Indians, serving to make the symbolism of the movie even more confusing. All of this discussion actually connects to another strand of postmodernist thought. For Marxist thinkers, those who are still trapped in the modern paradigm and believe that we are on our way to a communist utopia, postmodernism is just a new stage of capitalism. One of the things that typify this stage, they argue, is that products created by culture no longer just mask true reality, but replace it. In the past, art tried to capture a certain truth that governs history or reality. Now, artistic products are what they call a simulacrum, an artifact that pretends to be a simulation of truth, but is actually not simulating anything except perhaps other artifacts. And, in the postmodern age, this simulacrum is what is being perceived as reality. A good example is Jules quoting what he thinks is a Bible verse, when in fact it's a line from a movie. Inglourious Basterds, a movie that pretends to be historical but actually invents a history while copying from other war movies, seems to extend the simulacrum to encompass an entire film. And the fact that some people get vengeful satisfaction from it, as if this is what really happened, proves the point about postmodernism. For a non-Marxist like myself, however, this theory is laughable, especially since the so-called truth that Marxists want art to represent is based on nothing but a wild utopian fantasy. Their enslavement to this fantasy detaches Marxists from everyday reality, and that is why they have no understanding of pop culture and what its cultural artifacts represent. Tarantino does not think that his movie is just a simulacrum. He is trying to tell us something about reality, and obviously believes cinema is the best medium to do so. So what is it that he is trying to show? Well, unlike the Marxists, who regard every moment in time as part of a historical progress towards utopia, Pop is not interested in any historical process. Pop dwells in the now, believing it is the only reality there is, and tries to express the spirit of the time and make the most out of it. One of the main ways to do so is to liberate something that is repressed in contemporary culture, and turn the energy being liberated into ecstatic and joyful art. For decades, identity was one of the main sources of this process, as attributes that weren't part of a straight white male identity, and thus not represented in modern culture, broke through and expressed themselves through aesthetic means. But by the late 2000s, there was nothing more left to liberate. Nothing except the residual feelings of resentment and hate. In the past, the dominance of white men was justified by the rationality of the time. By now, that rationality has been so fundamentally transformed that it's hard for us to understand those times, understand how groups of people could have been treated in such ways. And so, many people feel outrage when they look back at this history, and Tarantino uses this angry energy to make pop artifacts. Inglourious Basterds doesn't try to represent history. It tries to represent the spirit of the moment, a spirit of vengefulness because of this history, and use that spirit to make a thrilling movie. Another theme is, once again, the meeting between American pop culture and other cultures. But here it is more complicated. The film takes place in Europe, the home of modern culture, and is set in what is still the modern age. The European characters are more sophisticated, and can usually speak several languages. The Americans, on the other hand, can't pass for anything but American even if their lives depend on it.
Grazie.
Nevertheless, it is the Americans that win, both militarily and culturally, and English is shown to be the more important language. Not knowing English brings calamity on Shoshana's family at the beginning of the movie. By the end of the movie, she learns some English, and that is the language that she uses for her payback speech. English is our universal language, and Hollywood played a big part in making it so, assisting in the triumph of American pop over European modernism. But now, we are in the global pop culture we saw in Kill Bill, and the American cultural autism might become a problem. The movie shows us again and again how important it is for your own survival to be familiar with other cultures, hinting that we need to adapt if we want to survive. When I first saw this movie, I didn't enjoy it very much. The fact that it started off as realistic, and then got more and more unreal as it went on, threw me off. On second viewing, however, it became my favorite Tarantino movie, and it remained so ever since, mainly because of the characters. Tarantino's characters are always delightfully eccentric, but this movie has the best ensemble. Above all, of course, is Hans Landa, the perfect Tarantino villain. Landa is like the human personification of a Tarantino movie, charming his victims with dialogue about mundane things, serving them tasty food, making them comfortable, and then unleashing his full psychotic cruelty. Only Tarantino could have conceived such a character, and Christoph Waltz, in his Oscar-winning performance, gives us one of the most memorable movie villains of all time. Inglourious Basterds also marks a shift in Tarantino's work, from movies that happen in the present to period pieces. This is a World War II movie, but there are elements of the Western in it. The Western, as we've mentioned, is a genre that artists often use when they want to discuss the nature and spirit of America. And this is a direction Tarantino was going in, as would be fully displayed in his next movie. However, the genre he pays homage to is not the traditional Hollywood Western. It is the spaghetti Western. The spaghetti Western is a genre that was born in the 60s, when Italian directors appropriated the Hollywood Western and made it their own way. While 50s Hollywood aspired to turn the Western into a serious drama genre, in which the inherent problems of American society would be played out, the Italian directors used it to present a cynical view of America. They took Westerns back to basics, aware that most viewers were there not to learn some moral lessons, but to enjoy watching people unscrupulously killing other people. Serious directors like Sergio Leone did it to make a statement about the brutal nature of American society, but most spaghetti westerns were just offering gratification. The biggest folk hero to come out of this genre was Django, first seen in the 1966 movie by that name, a movie that at the time was considered one of the most violent films ever made. Practically every single character in the movie, save the hero and his girl, ends up dead. We can see why Tarantino would like it. This is a recurring pattern that we see with Tarantino. The genres that he loves are violent genres like martial arts movies, blaxploitation films and spaghetti westerns. These genres are not just violent, they are pulp genres. Genres that generally offer gratification without any deeper messages. But Tarantino, with his dark view of human nature, evidently sees these movies as containing truths that more respectable genres dare not utter. By elevating these genres and making art out of them, he uses them to convey these truths in a deeper way. In that, he is a true pop artist. In Django Unchained, he appropriates this hero of spaghetti westerns and uses him to add to the folklore of the Wild West, presenting a folk hero it never had before, the Black Gunman. And through his story, he could add another chapter to his own trademark cinema of revenge. In many ways, Django Unchained repeats the formula of Inglourious Basterds. Once again it is a revenge fantasy, carried against evil white men of the past. This time, however, he gets closer to home, dealing with the dark side of America's history. And again, while we do get a brutally realistic depiction of some of the atrocities of slavery, the story is a complete fiction. There's no figure in history that Django is based on. He comes to us straight out of the history of cinema, out of the spaghetti western. The film even features a cameo appearance by Franco Nero, who played the original Django. Here he is playing Amerigo Vespucci, a name that reminds us that it was the Italians who discovered America. Now, what do the Italian westerns reveal to us about America? Americans, as depicted in the movie, care only about one thing: money. This is a staple of spaghetti westerns. They portray the soul of America as made of nickels and dimes, a place where people can even get paid for killing other people. Django Unchained continues this tradition, with its two bounty hunter protagonists. But it adds a dimension of slavery, of people being bought and sold for money. You don't see that much in the spaghetti westerns, as the issue of slavery was too controversial for that time. But now, Tarantino evidently felt that just like with the Holocaust, moviegoers are ready for this subject to get his special treatment. The heroes of spaghetti westerns were usually different from the people around them, in that their actions were driven by something more than money, mainly by love or revenge. In Django Unchained, the black hero is driven by love, but through his story he also gratifies the revenge fantasies which some black people still possess today. In an ironic reversal, while Inglourious Basterds featured an American helping Jews get their revenge on Germans, here it is a German who helps the black get his revenge on Americans. Germans, since the 1940s, were the perennial bad guys in Hollywood movies. It's as if every German, even if they weren't a Nazi, were doomed to forever have a swastika branded on their forehead. But here, Tarantino turns it around on his American audience, showing them a German protagonist who is more humane and sophisticated than the brutish Americans. Dr. Schultz begins the movie as a cynical man who has no qualms about killing a father in front of his son, if there is cash to be made. But his acquaintance with Django awakens his righteous side, and he helps him in his quest. What helps his moral awakening is that he recognizes Django as a modern Siegfried, the Norse mythology hero who went on a quest to save his beloved Brünnhilde. He tells Django the story, describing it as a famous German folk tale, but actually, the version he is telling is taken from the opera Siegfried, by Richard Wagner. So we see that even in the 19th century, people's minds were shaped mainly by the popular culture of the time. The only problem with that is that this opera was first staged in the 1870s, after slavery in the US was abolished. But anachronism is not really a problem in a movie like Django Unchained. Just like we saw in the previous movies, Tarantino shows us that the common tendency to cast white men as the villains is way too simplistic. The movie mentions the fact that there were black slavers, and the main villain of the story is not a white man at all, but a black man named Steven. Steven is what Django calls a head house nigger. I'm not sure that title actually existed in reality. And according to Django, it is almost as low as a black slaver. Steven is loyal to his white masters, so loyal that he internalized their racist worldview and believes in it more than them. As a result, he is a lot crueler than them when dealing with other slaves. What's particularly sinister about Steven is that he is playing a character. He is acting out the stereotype of the clownish black man, who is happy to entertain white people with his goofy and charming manners, gratifying their belief that he is simpler than them. Even after slavery had ended, there were many black entertainers who acted that way, and the more defiant African Americans accused them of degrading themselves, and degrading black folks in general. But some scholars were more forgiving, and argued that this was a mask, which blacks wore so they could keep their real selves hidden from the white world, free from oppression. Stephen is indeed wearing a mask, but when he reveals his true self, it turns out to be not of a proud black man, but of a dutiful slave who embraces his servitude. Even though he is a lot more intelligent than his white masters, he uses this intelligence to betray his black brothers and sisters, to maintain the ruling order in which he has power over them. Yet another brilliantly original Tarantino villain, reminding us that there are always evil people on the oppressed side as well. One of the questions that the movie asks is, why didn't the slaves rebel more? Why did the vast majority of them remain docile? And the answer that Tarantino seems to give is that this is human nature, that most people humbly accept their lot in life. Only 1 in 10,000 is a man like Django, who fights back. But Django is not some great emancipator. He is just another natural-born killer. Django Unchained does not give us hope that humanity can transcend its darker sides and create a better world. At the end of the movie, Django and his girl are alive and free and happy, but it's hard to see them surviving long. 2012, the year in which the movie was released, was the time when I realized that group identity was no longer a source of liberation. For decades, pop culture drew energy from liberating aspects that were associated with groups that were otherwise unsuppressed in Western society. It was fun to take part in the liberating process and find ways to enjoy previously forbidden fruits, and you also knew that in the process, you are helping minority groups achieve equality. But Django Unchained was the swan song of this period. In a year when the first black US president was re-elected for a second term, when the voters in 3 states decided to legalize gay marriage, one could no longer claim that American society otherwises and oppresses ethnic or sexual minorities. It was time to move on and look for other energy sources. But as pop culture moved on, it left identity politics in the hands of another force. The neo-Marxists, kicked to the sidelines by postmodernism and pop culture, latched on to group identity as a way to make a comeback. For years they were working in the shadows, infusing their hateful negativity into what pop culture made happy and positive. And now, they were ready to come to the fore. Marxism views society very differently from the way pop culture experiences it. In pop, the idea is that we are all part of the same society, and we are all being repressed in some ways. By the process of cultural exchange and appropriation, we are helping each other liberate ourselves, finding new joys and freedoms, and also equalizing the field so everyone has the ability to pursue happiness. The Marxists, on the other hand, view society as a battle between a dominating class and an oppressed class. They are not for cultural exchange that creates an ever-growing social harmony and cohesion, but for sharpening the differences between the classes, aiming at a revolution that will overthrow the dominant class and bring a utopian society where no one is repressed. After failing to get the working class to revolt, they turn to group identity, and manage to convince some individuals that they are oppressed because of their identity, that they are victims of a patriarchy of straight white men. Thus, they brought back the language of social disharmony and hate. But this new version of neo-Marxism is a sneaky one, and uses rhetorical techniques to disguise its radical views. This is what is known as the regressive left. The regressive left is an anti-liberal movement that masquerades as liberal, and it manages to fool a lot of liberals into supporting it. Back in late 2015, it seemed that Tarantino was fooled as well, as he made some statements supporting Black Lives Matter, a group that pretends to be liberal, when most of its leaders actually espouse the destruction of the liberal system. Shortly after, his new movie came out and got a lukewarm reception, so I didn't bother to go see it. But recently I watched it, and I realized that Tarantino, once again, made a movie that is very much reflective of the spirit of the time. The Hateful Eight is yet another western, but of a much smaller scope and with a small cast. And yet, this time it doesn't feel like Tarantino is just telling us a story about a group of natural-born killers, but actually trying to provide a microcosm of American society. It begins with 2 bounty hunters, one white and one black, just like in Django Unchained. So it starts out feeling like a continuation of the previous movie. But while the previous movie took place mainly in the sunny fields of springtime Mississippi, This time we find ourselves in the snowy mountains of wintertime Wyoming. And while the previous movie took place in the age of slavery, this time we are a few years after the Civil War, after emancipation. Has America become any better? No, not really. As our heroes get snowed in by a blizzard and take refuge in an isolated roadside cabin, we find ourselves back in the world of Reservoir Dogs, closed in one place with a group of people who don't know each other. And we are back to the non-linear style of storytelling, as we are trying to figure out, along with our heroes, who among them is not who he claims to be, who is plotting to murder them. We have come full circle. But there are also differences from Reservoir Dogs. There, the characters had no identity, and recognized each other only by assigned colors. Here, they recognize each other by the group identity, and what we see is that these different groups hate each other. Whites, blacks and Mexicans, men and women, northerners and southerners, all hate each other's guts. Temporary alliances are formed, based on mutual hostility to a third party, but they break up shortly after. The nature of America, as described in this movie, is of a place where the melting pot doesn't work, where there can never be social harmony. And while in Reservoir Dogs there was actually one character who managed to get away, in the Hateful Eight no one makes it out alive. The number 8 also rings a bell. There were 8 criminals involved in the heist in Reservoir Dogs, and there seem to be 8 main characters in this movie. Although, when the smoke clears and the final body count is tallied, we realize that there were more than 8 hateful people in that cabin. The name of the movie is actually a reference to Tarantino's own work, and the damning one. This is his 8th movie, and the title seems like an admission that they all contributed to the hateful atmosphere that was built up in America. He was giving aesthetic form to the vengeful undercurrents of American society, but now these undercurrents have burst their way to the surface. His previous 2 movies ended up with the house of the evil white men being exploded and burned to the ground. America is a house that was initially built by white men, who later allowed others to come in and take part in the project. If the American project is doomed, as the Hateful Eight seems to suggest, it is partly because it allowed identity politics to be transformed into hatred towards white men, and eventually hatred to the entire project. In the last scene, on their dying bed, the 2 remaining characters take solace in a letter by President Abraham Lincoln, which talks about how there is still work to be done, but we are on the right path to creating a just society. Except that they both know that the letter is actually a forgery. The idea of progress, the movie seems to be telling us, is nothing but a fantasy, a simulacrum that we hold on to even though we know it's not true. His previous 7 already made us doubt the idea of progress, but here it's not just that we are not progressing, it's that we are hurtling towards destruction, and the illusion of progress is blinding us to it. The Hateful Eight, then, is a tragic movie. But while other tragedies usually leave us with the feeling that life will still go on, The Hateful Eight provides no glimmer of hope for the future. Pop culture usually doesn't do tragedies. This is one of the main differences between pop and high culture. While the latter holds tragedy in higher regard than comedy, seeing it as a better representative of the human condition, pop regards comedy as the more truthful form. The modern age produced many great tragedies, and that is mainly because of the belief that this world is a miserable world, and misery will stop only if we achieve utopia. The constant failure to bring utopia led to a tragic perception of life. But pop perceives this world as basically good, with some bad mixed in it. It is true that nothing good lasts, that everything falls, but there is always something new that is good, so there is no reason to treat the fall as a tragedy. So, in the worldview of pop, the art that best captures the human condition is comedy, with some tragic elements blended into the mix. Reservoir Dogs was a tragedy, with some comic elements. Tarantino's subsequent films, on the other hand, were comedies with tragic elements. His revenge movies, in particular, were very enjoyable and satisfying, with the bad guys getting what's coming to them in the most spectacular fashion. But with The Hateful Eight, we are back to tragedy with comic elements, signifying an end to this period. In the pop frame of mind, this is not a big problem. We just close the book on that period and move on to the new thing. But there is always the nagging fear that a day will come when the pop age itself will come to an end, when the fun existence we are living in will fall and be replaced by a tragic existence. The Hateful Eight feels like doom. Just like Reservoir Dogs signified the end of the modern age, The Hateful Eight feels like it is heralding the end of the pop age. With such a dark outlook, one wonders where Tarantino can go from here. Reportedly, he is currently working on a movie revolving around the figure of Charles Manson. It shows that he is still fascinated by natural-born killers, but we'll have to wait and see what new insights he can bring. Will it be another movie about how America is doomed, or can he bring back some optimism? Meanwhile, there have been some changes in his personal life. Recently he got engaged. To an Israeli woman, actually. Let's check her out. Not bad. I actually know people who know her personally, and I'm told that she's very sweet. The two met when Quentin came to Israel for the premiere of Inglourious Basterds in 2009, and it should be noted that in the two movies he made since, there have not been any close-ups of women's feet. Draw your own conclusions. What's funnier for an Israeli is the realization of who else Quentin is going to be related to now. His new intended father-in-law was a big pop star in the 70s and 80s, with all the ridiculous trappings of a glam rocker. Then he became a bit of a joke, and today he is a cult figure in Israel, kind of like our David Hasselhoff. The thought that Quentin Tarantino is going to call him father is hilarious. Anyway, in Tarantino's next film, expect a scene like this.
Oh, mala, mala, mala. כל השירים והמנגינות, מעלה, 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 שירו עוד ועוד.
Let's get back down to today's reality. As I was working on this video, Tarantino became a target for social justice warriors, and they are trying to bring him down. One of the scary things about the regressive left is how it is trying to control art. While liberals believe that art should be offensive, because then it makes us face our own sensitivities and weaknesses and deal with them, regressive leftists believe that art should be used to shape the minds of the public according to what they perceive to be the correct values. They currently exert considerable amount of influence on Hollywood, and have a visible detrimental effect on the art of movie making. Tarantino is one of the artists who are fighting back, and I'm hoping that he will focus more on this problem in his future movies. However, there is a big question whether cinema is even capable of leading this fight anymore, or has its moment passed. A medium is vital only as long as there is dialogue between its artistic side and its populist side. Tarantino is an example of an artist who makes uncompromising art, and still manages to appeal to the masses. Only a medium that has such artists can have a cultural effect. Once its artists lose their popular appeal, it becomes a bubble that has almost no effect on general culture. Cinema was such a medium for the past 100 years, but it feels like its glory days are past. We are almost at the end of this decade, and it's hard to think of a director that came out of it whose films were both popular and great art. So when you go see a Tarantino movie, remember that we could be seeing one of the last of the great directors. Cherish it while it lasts.